Sure. So pretrial reform in North Carolina, and I would say around the country right now, is something that a lot of people are talking about. And they're talking about it because money should never determine a person's freedom. But in North Carolina and other states around the country, that is exactly what happens every day. We have people who can pay their bail and get out of jail and go home to their families, go home to their jobs, go home to their children, and come back when it's their time to show up in court and have their day in court. And then we have other people who can't pay their way out of jail and are forced to sit there until their day in court. And those realities are playing out all over the state in a way that's really detrimental for thousands of people.
So you're with the ACLU, and sometimes you all are working on things that everybody's paying attention to, and sometimes things that very few people are paying attention to. Tell me why you think this issue has risen to the level of concern it is in communities across our state.
I think that people have, for people who have been impacted by the system, it is something that they've been talking about for a long time. But I think as more people are becoming aware of the problem and becoming aware of the injustice of the system, it seems ludicrous that this is still how we're doing things and this is still how we're treating people. And I think it just is one of those sort of moments when we've seen reform in other states. I think that is something that folks are starting to learn more about and talk more about. We've seen the difference that reform can make in terms of people who are released from jail pre-trial and who do show up in court for their day in court. And the system is working in a lot of ways better than it was before, and there are more people who are able to be out of jail while they're awaiting trial. So I think those kind of state reforms and other things are informing the conversation here in North Carolina.
So I want to get specific here for a moment, because people need to understand what are the alternatives. No one wants violent offenders who have not yet been convicted out on the streets creating more violent crime. So how can we both be sure that we're keeping communities safe and not over incarcerate people who have not yet been adjudicated?
Well, I just want to be clear that when we talk about pre-trial, we're talking about people who have been charged but not convicted of a crime. And so I think that is an important distinction to remember in these conversations. We're talking about people sitting in jail who may be facing certain charges, but there has been no conviction, there has been no evidence put on by the state to show that this person is in fact the person who committed that crime. And I think there are all sorts of reforms that we could put in place that would be better solutions to the one that we're doing now. A lot of states have explored this and have implemented things like assessing for someone's risk rather than assigning. So just an example, in North Carolina right now, if we have two individuals who are charged with the exact same crime, let's say you're charged with a failure to disperse. Two people who don't know each other go to a protest. They are both charged with a Class 2 misdemeanor failure to disperse charge, which in most jurisdictions in North Carolina means that they're going to be forced to pay a $500 secured bond. One individual has $500 in their bank account. They can go and get that money out and pay and be released from jail and go back to court when it's their turn to do so. The other person doesn't have $500 in their bank account. They don't have somebody who can lend them that amount of money, so they stay in jail until they wait until their day in court. And I think that sort of disparity and that distinction between those two individuals is really the problem that we're talking about. And we're talking about it all up and down the scale of criminal charges, misdemeanors and felonies.
As a fundamental fairness issue.
As a fundamental fairness issue. You cannot, every day in North Carolina, there are similarly situated people who, but for the amount of money that they have in their bank account, are treated very differently by the system. Depending on your wealth, depending on how much money you can pay to the system to pay for your freedom, you can either go home to your family, to your job, to your community, or you can sit in jail. And I think those distinctions, as a matter of fundamental fairness, are the problem that we are confronting. And I think you know, to answer your question, there are a number of different potential reforms, solutions that could be something that wouldn't be reliant on money, that would better assess somebody's, you know, a lot of states have implemented risk assessments. I think a lot of other folks, especially communities that have been directly impacted by the system, are talking about the importance of a needs assessment. So not just assessing what is the risk that somebody would be released from jail and would go on to be a detriment to the public safety, or would not show up in court for their day in court. Instead of only assessing for the risk of somebody, assessing for what somebody might need in order to especially show back up to court.
Got it.
Because
Which is really the point of the pretrial system mostly, is to ensure that people show up for their day in court.
Yes, I think dating back to the time that we instituted bail, when we're thinking about like people living in North Carolina, and the worry was that people were going to flee to the frontier and not face their charges in court. That is what we are fundamentally trying to address, is that people show back up and that they answer to the charges that are brought against them.
So let's talk a little bit more specifically about risk, because there actually has been some pushback around the ways that we might try to assess risk by looking at factors that may or may not have disparate impact on certain individuals. So talk a little bit about the challenges with the alternatives.
Yes, so the ACLU and several other civil rights organizations around the country have stated explicitly that we have concerns with things like these algorithmic risk assessment tools because of the potential for racial bias and racial disparities to be baked into the calculation. When you are using something that assesses someone's risk, and that is based on prior criminal activity in terms of both arrests and convictions, when you're using a risk assessment tool that measures someone's connections to the community, it can be difficult to ascertain what is really assessing someone's risk and what is assessing for the fact that they live in a community that has long been over-policed.
Sure.
They are a Black and brown student in school and are far more likely to have interactions with school resource officers in school, that they, at every step of the way, there is a system that is biased against them. So
this is a challenge with our criminal justice system all around, and continues to be.
Yes.
On one hand, we worry about subjective measures because of the opportunity for discrimination. On the other hand, we worry even about these objective algorithms because of the opportunity for disparate impact. So what is the answer to a community scratching its head and trying to figure out how do we reform our system so that it's fair to the accused and fair to the community, both in terms of taxpayer dollars? What is the alternative?
I mean, I think that it is incredibly important if a jurisdiction, if a community is looking at something like replacing their current bond schedule with a risk assessment tool, if that is a path that they are going down, to be aware of the critiques of risk assessment tools and to evaluate on a regular basis what is happening in their system as a result of the implementation of the tool. And so, you know, one of the things that the ACLU is working on, in addition to our campaign to end cash bail, is to reduce the racial disparities in the system. And so if you put in place a risk assessment tool and then 6 months down the road you go back and look at the data and it tells you that although you have implemented this risk assessment tool and more people are getting out of jail on unsecured bonds or written promises to appear before their day in court, but the racial disparities haven't changed or they've in fact gone up, you may want to think about ways and really address how to remedy that.
So this is what's been interesting to me about communities that are trying to find a way to respond. It more is asking the question that is the value than necessarily the ultimate answer or solution they come up to. Would you agree from your perspective?
Yes. So I think asking the question and always being thoughtful about the reforms that you're putting in place and not having that be sort of your end point, but have that be dynamic over time. And I think always being able to evaluate the data and evaluate what the data is showing you about who's in jail, how long have they been there, what are their charges, what were their bond amounts, or if you're using a risk assessment tool, what was their risk level, and who's still there after all of this, and how can we be better? How can we do something that is going to not be a detriment to public safety, but that is going to remedy the fact that right now we have people sitting in jail across our state. 86% of people who are sitting in jail in North Carolina right now, this varies by jurisdiction, but across the state it's 86%, are sitting there and have not been convicted of a crime. And for the most part, these are folks who have not been charged with violent crimes, who have not, who are not facing charges that would make the rest of us think twice about that. They're just people who can't afford to pay their bail.
So I asked you at the outset to give us some sense of why this is beginning to be such a talked about issue in North Carolina. And I'm going to ask you a related question here, which is, it's interesting the stakeholders that have come together around this. So we're not just talking about the quantity of people, but we actually have district attorneys and public defenders and judges and conservatives and progressives in communities all saying this is a huge issue. Why so?
I think it is the clearest, darkest picture of an unfair system, and that bothers all of us who have a role to play in the criminal justice system, both advocates and institutional players like DAs, like public defenders, like judges. People need to believe, want to believe, but fundamentally need to believe that our criminal justice system is fair and that no matter how much money you have, no matter the color of your skin, it is a system that will treat you fairly. And we have a lot of work to do in a lot of different areas of that to make that that dream, that hope, a reality. But I think there is a recognition of that, and this is one area where it's very stark, and it is based only on the amount of money that you have in your wallet and nothing else that often determines your freedom and often determines the downstream collateral consequences of that.
Susanna, is there anything that I have not asked you that you really want our viewers to know about the system or about the efforts to reform the system?
I will just say, because we haven't talked about it yet, and I don't know if it's of interest, but the ACLU's campaign to end cash bail in North Carolina is part of a nationwide campaign for smart justice with the goal of decreasing racial disparities in the system by half. Excuse me, do over.
Take your time.
Okay. By eliminating the racial disparities in the system and decreasing our current prison and jail population around the country by half. And in North Carolina, when we were thinking about what are the ways that we can engage in a campaign for smart justice, we realized that we cannot end mass incarceration in North Carolina without ending our current system of cash bail in the way that we do things, in the way that we hold thousands of people in jail in North Carolina for no other reason than they can't afford their bail.
Got it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yep, thank you.